Good evening. Good evening, and a very warm welcome to King's this evening. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, for tuning in to the latest instalment of our Enlightening Minds lecture program. This is now the second year of our Enlightening Minds program that is designed to kind of stimulate intellectual curiosity, discovery, and hopefully plenty of conversations, both this evening in terms of our Q&A at the end of this evening's talk, but also perhaps back home as well, over the dinner table as well, between pupils and parents. But also this is very much directed to all of our King's community, so whether that is staff as well, whether it's governors, and also lots of our alumni who I'm sure are joining in as well. So thank you very much, everybody that is here in person, but also everybody else that is joining via the live stream. If you are, for those people who are here in person in the concert hall, we're not expecting the fire alarm to go off, but if it does, then please follow me and our pupil helpers kind of out through that door and the door that you came in as well, and we will congregate on the first 15 rugby pitch. We're very pleased, in association with the King's Association, to be able to host these talks free of charge. Thank you very much to all of those people who, when they were booking their ticket via the box office, also opted to do a voluntary donation. All of that goes straight to our school's bursary fund, which ensures that kind of everybody gets to, has the opportunity to enjoy the King's experience. I think that is nearly everything from me. The final thing is that when we do come to our Q&A, for those people who are joining remotely, that you are able to ask questions via X with the hashtag KCS Enlightening Minds. Okay, so that's hashtag KCS Enlightening Minds. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Arvind and to Sophie to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you very much.
During the build-up to the 2024 US presidential election, arguably the most divisive in the country's history, Simon Parker embarked upon a 4,227-mile cycling journey through 11 states from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, meeting hundreds of fascinating Americans along the way. His aim? To better understand America, its people, politics, and problems before the election at the gentle pace of a bicycle. A British travel writer, author, filmmaker, public speaker, and broadcast journalist, if it involves travel, intriguing people, and an untold story, then he's interested.
In the past decade, he has reported from over 100 countries, from Bhutan and French Polynesia to Hawaii and Namibia. He's interviewed politicians and celebrities, as well as sporting icons such as Federer and Nadal. He has reported on a diverse array of stories, including the shortages in Venezuela and the migrant crisis in Greece. He's paraglided solo through the Andes, hiked Bali's highest volcanoes, and driven a rickshaw the length of India. In 2016, Simon sailed and cycled from China to London in 133 days. And in 2022, he published his first book, charting his 3,427-mile journey around pandemic Britain. He also has an award-winning TV series called Earth Cycle, which can be found on Amazon Prime and YouTube. Please join us in welcoming Mr. Simon Parker.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for that warm welcome. As you've just heard, my name is Simon Parker. I am a broadcast journalist, a travel writer, a newspaper columnist, and I've been extremely lucky to travel all around the world to well over 100 countries. I've got to report from places like Svalbard, like this ice cave right in the middle of the Arctic winter. The thing I remember most about this day was just how painfully cold it was. Minus 45 degrees centigrade. I've traveled and reported from Machu Picchu on behalf of BBC Radio 4. This was a dispatch from our own correspondent all about Andean spectacled bears, Paddington bears, and how humans had been encroaching upon their lands. And I've traveled the length of the Zambezi River in southern Africa for the Daily Telegraph, and I made a documentary series all about these precious pangolins, these armor-plated pangolins. They are the world's most trafficked mammal. And the really fascinating thing about them, as well as being completely harmless, is they have tongues which are even longer than their bodies. And they spend their whole lovely lives just hoovering up termites and ants. As you've just heard, one of the craziest and silliest ideas I ever came up with was to drive these two 3-wheeled 7-horsepower rickshaws the length of India, 2,500 miles. If anyone in the room is starting to think this is a wonderful way of spending next year's summer holiday, I will give you one piece of advice. Don't do it under any circumstances. I was very, very lucky to come out of that one alive. However, as you've also just heard, probably the silliest journey I've ever been on was a commission for the BBC in 2016. And I sailed and cycled halfway around the world. And it involved sailing across the Pacific, cycling across the United States, sailing across the Atlantic, and then cycling through Europe. 15,000 miles by land and sea. It took me 133 days. And believe it or not, this is a relatively calm day in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Now that journey kind of quite unexpectedly came along in 2016 and ended up cycling from Seattle all the way to New York. It took me 7 weeks to get across America. And by fluke, I was cycling across America in the lead up to the 2016 election in which Donald Trump was elected for the very first time. And although I was traveling across America trying to make a documentary all about human endurance and what it was like to sail and cycle halfway around the planet, I was hit by this incredible American generosity and hospitality that I hadn't fully accounted for. And when I wasn't camping on the side of the road or in a ditch or in a national park, I was invited into people's homes. And many, many people wanted to talk to me about politics and wanted to talk to me about the state of modern America. And as a journalist, it just felt like something of a travesty that I was trying to race across America as quickly as possible, because really that was the most interesting story. The fact that there was this grubby British bloke on a bicycle moving across America, and people wanted to open up to me in a way that they felt more comfortable speaking to me than they did so their compatriots. So 7 years passed, and I decided that if I was ever going to go and cycle across America again, I should get out there and do it right now in the lead up to the 2024 presidential election. And I dreamt up this crazy idea of trying to get across America again. The blue line is 2016, and the green line is 2023. Now, when you look at a map of the United States, when you zoom in on Seattle, you realize that Seattle isn't actually the northwesternmost point of the United States. I'd actually shortchanged myself something by going from Seattle to New York. So I decided that I wanted to head to a place called Near Bay. And Near Bay is the northwesternmost point of the contiguous United States. Now, I started thinking about it, so I'm going to start this journey from the northwesternmost point of the contiguous United States. Where is the southeastern? That's where my imagination starts to jump, and that is Key West, Florida. So as a journalist, as a writer, as an author, as a storyteller, I had my A and my B, and I had 10 weeks to do it. Now, the journey began by hitchhiking from Seattle all the way out to Near Bay. I got to Near Bay. I took this very cheesy selfie next to the Pacific Ocean, because from here on in, I would only ever be heading in a southeasterly direction. And in those first few days, I spent it in the Olympic Peninsula, in these epic forests. Now, this is Sasquatch territory. This is the realm of Bigfoot. And outside local convenience stores and gas stations, you would see these big 12-foot carvings of these big hairy men warning against shoplifters. But these were the sorts of beautiful forests that I was passing through, these big redwoods, these big Douglas firs. And it was off to quite a soft start, away from traffic and really just enjoying the great outdoors of the Pacific Northwest. Now, the problem, however, with choosing a journey that goes from a very specific A and B is that when you get to places like Seattle, you end up in something of a bottleneck. And it meant that I had to travel around the northwestern coast of Near Bay, and then I had to try and give Seattle something of a wide berth. And thankfully, people started to reach out to me and say, this journey that you're undertaking is ridiculous, but it's also fascinating. You're more than welcome to come and stay with us. And one of those people was Catherine Railsbeck. And Catherine Railsbeck lives at a place called the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action. And what they're trying to do is raise awareness for nuclear weapons in the United States. Now, not a lot of people knew this locally to the area, but on the other side of that fence is the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons anywhere in the world. And she invited me to go and spend the night in her peace pagoda, where I ended up spending the evening sleeping surrounded by photos of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King and the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And they told me about some of the campaigns that they've been doing over the course of the last 50 or 60 years. Because irrespective of if America has a Republican or a Democratic government, America seems to be pretty steadfast on its commitment to nuclear weapons. And they spend $860 billion a year just on defense, way more than any other country in the world. And they have something like 5,500 nuclear weapons, more so than any other country on the planet. Now, what they do most of the time, this group of campaigners, is they go to the nuclear Trident base and they protest outside it. And most of the time, it's pretty, it's pretty futile. They just do stuff like this. But they did tell me about this quite funny act of protest. They said that they found out that the US Navy had trained a pod of Californian dolphins to patrol the waters around the United States Trident missiles. And they're essentially like kamikaze dolphins, these things. They found out about these dolphins, thought it was a really ridiculous use of these wonderful animals, that as a kind of wry act of protest, they decided to knit all of these Californian dolphins woolly jumpers just to keep them warm in the frigid waters of the Pacific Northwest. And they dropped them off on the front step. But most of these people have either been arrested or have spent time in prison for standing up what they believe in. Now, it was after about 2 or 3 days that I started to realize how much chaos I was in. Nothing can fully prepare you for the level of chaos of traveling like this. And the only way of really dealing with this sort of lifestyle is to pour everything out and then put everything back in. However, this is the reality of what I need just to do my job as a journalist and as a travel writer and as a filmmaker. I need my sleeping bag, I need my drone, I need my recording equipment, and this is before I've even packed an extra pair of socks. This is what I need to do my job. Now, right up in the Pacific Northwest, as I was cycling through rural communities, I was already starting to realize that Americans love signage. It is the land of signposts. And obviously, this household is quite a liberal, left-leaning household. This one, not so much. But even in the rural Pacific Northwest, which is traditionally a very blue, very left-leaning part of the United States, I was starting to see a support base for Donald Trump. And I would see this across the United States. Rural communities equals Republican leaning. And I think those lines are a lot more blurred in the United Kingdom. But in the US, this is the sort of thing that you would see. And people would use these huge billboards wherever possible outside their properties. If they had a fence, they would put something up like this. And it really did get me thinking about that difference between Britons and Americans. You know, if in the UK, if you're quite a political person, you might go as far as putting up an A5 sheet in your kitchen window saying that you're supporting the Liberal Democrats. And that's about as extreme as we go. Whereas this is quite a modest political declaration outside someone's property. Now, as I got around Seattle, I started to head up into the North Cascades National Park. And I started following these wonderful things. And these are old railroad trails, which were built by the Milwaukee Railroad Company. And they're brilliant because they only run at about 2% gradient, and they take you up and through the mountains. I was quickly learning also in the United States that there is a bit of a trend of hanging out of your window and shooting road signs. But where these roads cannot go around the mountain or over the mountain, they go through the mountain. And this is Snoqualmie Tunnel. And Snoqualmie Tunnel is 2.5 miles long. And it's a decommissioned tunnel. There are no lights in it whatsoever. And I just had to keep going and keep going, believing that I was going to find light on the other side. And on the other side, I bumped into this guy. And this guy was called Ben Yao. And Ben Yao was on day 79 of an 80-day bike trip across the United States from Washington, D.C. to Washington State and Seattle. And unsurprisingly, he was trying to palm off as much of his stuff on me as possible. I had, by great coincidence, just lost a sandal about 2 or 3 hours earlier. It had fallen off the back of my bike. So he gave me his flip-flops. So by the end of this journey, I was probably wearing America's best traveled flip-flops. They'd gone one way across America, and then they went with me all the way back across the other. However, if there's some sort of lesson out of meeting someone like Ben, he had just left his first year at university, hated it, had had a bit of a falling out with his parents, and as an act of protest, he decided to buy a bicycle and spend his whole summer cycling across America. So students and parents, make of that what you will. You go from the very lush, very damp Cascades, and on the other side, you end up in a place called the Channeled Scablands. And the Channeled Scablands is a region of Washington State in which huge amounts of agriculture take place. This is the sort of epicenter of apple growing, but also potatoes. But climate change is having a huge impact on the climate of this region, that they're getting summer temperatures of well in excess of 40 degrees centigrade. And this means that they're not getting any rain from above, but huge aquifers from below are starting to become much, much drier. And scientists are predicting that there might only be about 10 or 15 years worth of water to sustain this region. Now, I pushed on through the Channeled Scablands, and I ended up at my first ever rodeo. And I ended up in a place called Ritzville, and I stood out like a sore thumb because I was the only guy for about 100-mile radius wearing shorts and flip-flops. But I was taken in like a long-lost friend by the people of Ritzville Rodeo. I was bought about 10 pints of beer, and I stumbled out of this place at about midnight, having had the best night of my life, having been taken in by so many wonderful, generous, hospitable people. However, one thing did start to appear here, which would follow me across America, and that's many Americans telling me that they had lost the ability to talk about politics with each other. Politics had started to rip apart their family and friendship groups. They'd fallen out with their uncles and aunties about supporting or hating Trump or the policies of the Biden administration. People have become so disjointed in their inability to agree to disagree that people have stopped talking about politics. And I found this all across the United States, but it really started to sort of I really did start to think about this as being a very worrying sign for democracy. If we cannot talk to each other about the things that we have, our different opinions, then sort of what future do any of us really have? Now, it stayed very, very arid as I pushed through eastern Washington and crossed over the border at Spokane into the Idaho Panhandle. I went through the Panhandle and I crossed over into Montana. And most of the roads for about the first 1,000 miles were pancake flat, and I was out in these wonderful agricultural settings. However, all you've got to do is basically cross the border into Idaho, and then all of a sudden the Rocky Mountains start to rise up. And this coincided of having to cross my first proper mountain pass of the day with a huge storm. It was one of the worst storms I've ever cycled in. And I got stuck on the side of this road, had to climb 5,000 feet. And after about 6 hours, I stumbled into a diner on the side of the road, ordered this huge stack of pancakes, and these people on this other table next to me, they said, "I'm awfully sorry, but were you that crazy guy we just saw on the side of the road?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm afraid so." And basically, it transpired that they lived about 3 hours cycle further east. And they said, "Well, we live in a tiny town called Wallace, Idaho, and if you make it that far, come and stay with us." So 3 hours later, I ended up knocking on their door. Within about 5 minutes, I was in the shower. All of my clothes were being washed and dry cleaned. And then, very conveniently, they lived about a 90-second walk from the local brewery. So we went and had a couple of beers when the dust had settled. And they were quite interesting people because they were very left-leaning, liberal people, but they lived in a staunchly Republican corner of the United States. And what they were like snowbirds in reverse. They spent half of their year living down in Florida, but they were very keen skiers. So half of the year they drove up to the Rocky Mountains and they would spend their winters in the Rockies. Now, Alice and Jeff, what they told me had shocked them the most about living in the Rockies in the last sort of 10 or 20 years was just how warmer it was getting. And it was very rare for me to find anyone in the United States who would really concede to the fact that climate change even existed. In Middle America, I met a lot of people who just believed climate change was God's will. It was an act of God, nothing any human beings could do about it. However, these people told me that for the first time last summer, they saw squirrels coming down from the mountains and drinking out of streams in the middle of town because there was no food and there was no water on the mountainside. Now, this was something that I would hear several times as I moved from Idaho into Montana. And I made it to Deer Lodge. Deer Lodge is a very tiny little hamlet on the side of the road. I went into a little convenience store, and the lady behind the cash register said, "Last summer, for the first time ever, we had a grizzly bear come down into town because there was no food or water on the mountain." I said, "Wow, that's incredible. What happened to the bear?" And she said, "We shot it." And then I said, "Whoa, that's very American. Then what happened to the bear?" She said, "Well, we gave it to the high school for dissection." I said, "Wow, that really is incredible." And she said, "You're in Montana now. We're pretty rough up here." But that was a lovely sort of like interaction about meeting people along the way, and as a journalist, as a travel writer, trying to find those little examples, these big issues that we're facing around the world, finding those little ground-level examples for people to tell me about that. And before we go any further, I want to show you our first short film. The sense of nothingness out here is quite captivating, quite bleak, but I also find quite beguiling. I have been on this road for the last 2 hours, and there hasn't been a single turn-off or a single corner. And I've now reached a slight bend in the road, and it's made me strangely excited. It feels like something to celebrate. These are exactly the sorts of landscapes that I was desperate to find on this journey across the United States. am about a mile from the top of Lookout Pass, which is one of the highest elevations I'm going to have to go on this entire trip. And this has happened. My first puncture of this whole adventure. So I've got to strip the bike down, take the tyre off, repair the inner tube and get straight back at it. But more than anything, just try and remind myself that this is all just part of the experience and that I've managed to go almost 700 miles without a puncture. So it is what it is. Time to just crack on with it and fix it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. I don't take these journeys for granted. However tough this adventure might be, I don't lose sight of the fact that this is a huge privilege to get to do this thing for a living and to see these sorts of sights. And this is the great American West. This is Montana in all its glory, surrounded by mountains and livestock and ranches, and cycling along these long straight roads that go on for tens and tens of miles. This is utterly epic. I have spent all morning, about 4 hours, cycling into a headwind that must be 15 or 20 miles per hour, and it is just so demoralizing. It is like cycling through porridge. You just really don't feel like you're moving very efficiently at all. It is a very beautiful place to be cycling. I'm still very much in the Rocky Mountains. I'm surrounded by green trees and ranches and pastures filled with livestock, but cycling into a headwind, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, Montana, back at home, you could be anywhere. Cycling in wind is just tough. So I've now made it to Montana, big sky country, and up until about 200 years ago, these huge prairies were inhabited by hundreds of thousands of bison until the Europeans turned up with a taste for this free beef and almost eradicated them off the face of the earth. Now, one thing that I was starting to realize about traveling through the Wild West, or the so-called Wild West, is that it's not actually really that wild at all anymore. And I was basically on every side, both sides of the road, I would have barbed wire, and I couldn't go into those lands. And this journey really did make me appreciate the average American appreciation for private property. Private property is taken a lot more seriously in the United States than perhaps we take it in England. And it really did left me appreciating our right to roam and our countryside and our national parks that we have in this country, because so much of the United States is cut off to the general public. So the next time you go rambling off down a bridle path or something like that, really think yourself very lucky in contrast to the United States. Now, I bumped into this guy, Cody Chief Child Meeks, and he was the senator for the Crow Agency, and he was the leader of the Crow people. And the Crow Agency is one of about 550 Native American tribal lands, reservations, that about 200 years ago, the Native American peoples of the United States were essentially kettled into, and they were no longer allowed to live their nomadic lifestyles, and they were put onto these reservations. It was really interesting to speak to him and interview him for my book, completely at random. I just bumped into him in a convenience store, and he told me he told me what I'd already seen, basically. There is this great difference between essentially what is white European America and Native America in these reservations. And the socioeconomic situation of his people was vastly different to the rest of America. You can rarely find a gas station. You can rarely find a convenience store. You can rarely find a school on a Native American reservation. I said to him, does this not leave you with a degree of bitterness towards the history of your people and the history of your country? And he very maturely said, we have to get over this in order for us to look at reparations or creating a better future for our children and their children. We have to get over this as quickly as possible and try and negotiate with the wider white America. Now, as I passed over from Montana into Wyoming, the average Wyoming citizen was $20,000 a year better off because there is oil beneath Wyoming, and it's had a great impact on their fortunes. And I crossed over from Crow Reservation here into the north of Wyoming. And the thing I think I'll remember most about being in Wyoming was just the wide open spaces. I could cycle for 5 or 6 hours without seeing another vehicle. And I think one of my favorite memories would be being on roads like this and having herds of pronghorn deer skipping alongside me, sometimes 40 or 50 of them for about 4 or 5 minutes, following alongside me and then skipping across the road. Now, at this point from Wyoming, I have just crossed over the border into Nebraska, and Nebraska is seen as one of those flyover states. It is a state in the United States which very few foreign tourists go to. So I was taken in once again like a long-lost relative by these Trump-supporting, gun-toting Nebraskan farmers who were all lovely, lovely people, and they started telling me about how proud they were to live in Nebraska. And I said, what's that all about? Why are you so proud to live in Nebraska? And it was all down to the anonymity of living right in the middle of the country. I could compare it to maybe living in the Scottish Highlands or on a Scottish island or something. They loved the idea of living in rural middle America. And I said, what's that all about? And they said, well, we've become quite frightened about terrorist attacks and things like that. And they said to me, put it this way, if the world takes a shit, you're going to want to be in rural Nebraska. And as I cycled on through these expansive cornfields, I think they had a point. And I was being followed on a daily basis by these enormous trains. These trains followed me across America. They are 3 miles long, and they are manned by just 2 people, a driver and an engineer. And these trains basically keep the lights on in America. They transport everything from flour to new televisions to oil, gas. And despite how big they are, they still had this incredible ability of sneaking up on me and sounding their horns just behind me, and I'd jump out of my skin. Now, I think the next few photos perfectly demonstrate and illustrate just how quickly things can change on a journey like this when you're out in the open. And in the space of just 2 or 3 hours, I'd gone from being in wonderful conditions to a little bit of rain, then a little bit of wind, and over the course of the afternoon, the winds built up to become about 50 or 60 miles per hour, to the extent that I could no longer cycle. And I was being followed by these huge hailstones, which are the size of golf balls. And I eventually managed to take refuge in a convenience store. And I got stuck in this convenience store, and this is what happened next. I've been caught in a absolutely huge thunder and lightning storm, and there are fork lightning bolts coming down all around me. I've spent about the last hour taking refuge in a hardware store, and this kid who's come from high school to do the evening shift has taken pity on me, and he said, right man, your motel is about 300 feet, or maybe even like, I don't know, 500 feet down the road. Jump into my van, or the hardware store van, and I'll give you a ride down there. And to save my bike from falling over, I've decided to stand in the back, and you can hear the rain around me. I have never ever really experienced a storm quite this bad. It is seriously intense. In a tornado. And it got so bad that I had to take refuge in a dingy motel on the side of the road. And for the rest of the evening, I did the very British thing of watching the weather channels and having the curtains wide open so that I could just watch the storm roll through. I was in a tornado. It was quite an incredible thing. But I was very glad not to be cycling into it. And by cycling into this tornado, I had now entered Tornado Alley. And Tornado Alley is this big sort of swathe of about 7 or 8 states where tornadoes are very prevalent. And by entering Tornado Alley, I'd also now entered the so-called Bible Belt, but also very much the land of signage once again. Americans love signposts, and they use signposts. If someone's got a cornfield on the side of the road, they will tell you about their religious opinions. They will use signage to tell you about dodgy characters lurking in the undergrowth. Americans love to use, American small towns love to tell you about their small town heroes, like Ryan Nolan, World Duck Calling Champion 2008. But again, I think this is something which, as someone who's now cycled across America twice, you really start to zone into things like this. If you're zipping through in a car or in a train, you don't quite have the sort of bandwidth to take all these things in because you're so safely cocooned from everything. But it's little things like this which I really love about the United States, that cherishing of your small town heroes. Now, as I passed over into Oklahoma, the temperatures were rising to such an extent that I had to basically get up at like 4 o'clock every single morning to try and do 5 or 6 hours of cycling before the temperatures got too much. And I spent those times in Oklahoma cycling into these beautiful sunsets. And you're about to get a taste of that in this next short film. When this is all over, I'm pretty sure that these are the memories that I'll cherish the most. Being up at the crack of dawn, cycling on long, straight roads, surrounded by oil pumps, and cycling into a rising sun. And a Coca-Cola lorry zooming past me. Really does feel like I'm in the heart of this country. I have now reached the state of Oklahoma, and it's a place that I've always wanted to visit ever since reading John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. If you haven't read that book, highly recommended. But cycling through here, it's almost like the flashpoint, the epicenter of a changing America and its dependence on fossil fuels, because all across this horizon you see these pump jacks These are these oil extractors which are bringing oil out from deep under the earth. However, on this side, there are hundreds of wind turbines, and they are whizzing round on this very, very windy day, a wind that I am battling into. But it's seeing things like this in the flesh that really give you an idea of how America is changing on the ground, and especially its dependency on different forms of energy. America, I love you. This is not personal, but 99% of the coffee that's being drunk in this country is a crime against humanity. So I've had to take the law into my own hands, buy my own travel cafetiere, and plunge on the roadside. Cheers. That is, however, more than enough from me for this week, and instead I'm going to leave you with a few words from a man called Bryson Hare, and he is one of the many voices that is going to be part of my new book. And I asked him about the state of modern America, and he kindly shared some of his opinions with me.
How do I feel about the United States? I just feel like we're separated as a whole. I feel like people don't know who they are, and people are scared to explore things and try new things. People are so separated, and poverty is so high right now because of inflation that a lot of people are just lost. We're a lost place right now, and it's scary because you can't count on your president either. Like, you know, we don't know what we're getting told. I bet you could ask 70%, you could probably ask 85% of people my age what a Democrat or a Republican is. And I'd say about 75, they're saying, you ask everybody my age, 22 years to 18 to 22 years old, what party is Joe Biden from? They won't give you the answer. They don't know the answer. You ask them what a Democrat is, they don't know the answer. You ask them what a Republican is, they don't know the answer. People they scared, not scared, but they just don't have the interest in, they'll talk about it, but they don't understand like that we can make a difference. And you know, they get stuck with that mindset of that nobody can make a difference, that the United States is down such a path that they've been taking since the 60s, that, you know, we're gonna put ourselves in a hole pretty soon. And like I was telling you about conspiracy theories, a lot of people my age they go crazy over conspiracy theories. People rather believe in aliens than believe in God.
Now, as I moved into the east of Oklahoma, I had the wind at my back, thank goodness, and I was rattling along at an amazing speed. Oklahoma and Nebraska are almost completely flat, and if you end up with a decent tailwind behind you, you can race along with barely breaking a sweat. So you can do sort of 90 or 100 miles if you're sort of reasonable fitness. The issue I was facing, however, was the lack of good food. I had now entered the food deserts of the United States. And the food deserts are a real thing. Food deserts are 76 counties in the United States, I should say, in which 20 million people do not have access to fresh food. No fresh food whatsoever. Only food you can get is kind of like fried food or heavily processed food that you find in gas stations or convenience stores. And it meant that this was a relatively good meal at the end of a long day. Super noodles and green peas to ward off scurvy for an extra couple of days. But it was a great place places like gas stations were brilliant places to meet people, loitering around in places that I shouldn't be, speaking to people about the size of their vehicles. on a bicycle, but whenever you spend any time in America, in contrast to the tiny little vehicles that we drive in this country, in America, bigger is always better. And I got talking to the guy who owned this van, and I said to him, man, this pickup is enormous. Do you really need to drive a car that big? And he said to me, you know what? When I pay off my credit card, they do one even bigger, and I'm going to get that one. And it really was fascinating just to have those little moments of talking to people about those differences between the way we live our lives and the way they live their lives. We're very, very similar, but there are tiny little differences between many people. I made a promise to my wife that if the road ever narrowed to such an extent that I was going to get squished by a vehicle, I would ask politely and someone would give me a ride. And I got to the Arkansas River, and the road narrowed to just one lane in either direction. So I, at this point, had been holding a trump card in my back pocket. And that back pocket and that trump card is received pronunciation. If you ever find yourself in a bit of a scrape in Middle America, just talk very politely like a 1950s BBC broadcaster, and walk up to someone and just say, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm in a bit of a scrape. Please, can you help me out? And before I could even mention Midsummer Murders, the back seats were down, and I'd been bundled into the back like a grubby Labrador, and I was being taken across the Arkansas River. Now, while I'm on the theme of dogs, they were my biggest problem across America. Not people, not cars. My biggest worry were dogs. Horrible guard dogs in the middle of nowhere, which would run out of properties and farms and try and tear me off my bike. To such an extent that I had to resort to a very, very big stick. This was my first line of defense. But I was probably 4 or 5 times a day, I was being chased by Rottweilers, Pit Bulls, Staffies. And once again, I think this has a lot to do with the American obsession with private property and guarding that little patch of land in a way that I found quite hard to comprehend as a Briton. But I was getting so afraid and so terrified about being killed by a dog that I went to a police station and I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. What are my rights? I really need to find a solution for dealing with these dogs. And they'd never been asked a question like this before. And they all looked at each other and had a little conference for 2 or 3 minutes. And they said to me, well, if you need to defend yourself against the dog, you can defend yourself in the same way you would defend yourself against a human being. And I said, brilliant. What's the answer? They said, you've got to buy a gun. I said, buy a gun? Is that the answer? And they said, yeah, you've got to buy a gun. So I spent another couple of 100 miles thinking to myself, can I really buy a gun? That's ridiculous. I'm a tourist. I probably can't buy one. Secondly, where am I going to keep it? Thirdly, do I have it in me to shoot a dog at point-blank range? Probably not. And then fourthly, I thought to myself, well, if I'm in the middle of nowhere and I've just shot someone's dog, I'm on my bike, and then I'm dealing with a really pissed-off person whose dog I've just killed. So that's probably something I shouldn't be doing. But then it did dawn on me what might be a more humane use. And this came completely by accident. And it is this thing. I was riding along one day, drinking a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. And this glass bottle of Coca-Cola dropped to the floor and made this almighty explosion. So I hypothesized that if a dog ever came running at me, I could throw a bottle at the ground between me and the dog, and it may frighten away this dog. And there was this one afternoon that this huge mongrel started running towards me, and I threw this bottle at the ground. It made this huge explosion, and it turned around and ran off. So this was my sort of slightly different, novel way of dealing with these dogs. And when I was at probably my most testing situation, I had pepper spray, bear spray, Coca-Cola, and I had hot spicy sauce, which I would also throw at the ground if things got really, really bad. So from Arkansas, I crossed over into Mississippi. In Mississippi one afternoon, I got chased into a a cotton field. Got talking to this guy, really nice cotton farmer. About half an hour later, I thought nothing of it. I found him about half an hour ahead of me in a lay-by with a burger and fries and a drink, and just said I thought what you were doing was ridiculous, and you need to have some food, so I thought I'd buy you a drink. And then when I crossed over into Mississippi, the annoying thing was that the hard shoulders were all of a sudden not very hard. They became very, very bumpy. But then as I crossed over into the wilds of Alabama, western Alabama, really surprised me. Very, very beautiful golden forests. And as you can see in this photo, I'd upgraded my big stick to a big metal pole that I'd found on the side of the road if I did come face to face with another Rottweiler. But before we finish, I'm going to show you one final film, and this is my approach into Alabama. I have made it to Alabama, and I must say my first impressions are wow. I don't know what I really expected, to be honest, but I've spent the last hour or so, wow, up there I just saw deer trotting across the road. I've spent the last hour or so surrounded by lush forest. It's quite a cool autumnal morning, but this is a landscape I didn't really know existed. Quite phenomenal. I think I'm going to very much enjoy this morning. The great joy of travel is seeing places with your own eyes and having your preconceptions challenged and changed. And I must say that that is exactly the case with Alabama. I don't know what I expected, but I wasn't expecting this. Firstly, I was expecting it to be a lot flatter, pancake flat. When I looked at the map of America, I was thinking, get across the Rockies and it would be completely flat thereafter. I was completely wrong. I've been doing a lot of climbing for the last couple of days. And also the great sense of space and forest. Again, I don't really know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. And that is why we all travel, isn't it? To just experience places firsthand. And rather than just trusting an image on Google or in a book, seeing it with our own eyes. This is one of those very frustrating moments. I've been making brilliant time today, thinking that everything was going swimmingly, and now I have sustained a very, very, very bad puncture. Back tire is completely lacerated, so I'm just going to have to try and patch it up as best as I can. On the side of this quite busy road, I was just starting to salivate at the prospect of a cold beer. I'm about 70 miles in, I've got about 10 or 12 miles left, and then this happens. And it's always the back tire. That's what makes these things so annoying. If it was the front tire, it'd be fine, but back tire, everything's got to come off, chain's got to come off, even the kickstand's got to come off on this bike. I am now, quite remarkably, more than 3,000 miles into this ride across America. And now I have Alabama behind me, and ahead of me, well, it looks exactly the same, Florida. And that is where I'm going. I've got about another 2.5 weeks and about 1,000 miles to cycle all the way to Key West, Florida. Thank you very much for following along with this journey. Please subscribe to the channel, like the videos, leave me a comment, and I'll get back to you. But for now, it's time for me to get back on the road. Trying to do the very cocky thing of riding a bike and flying a drone at the same time, which, as you've clearly seen, is impossible. But those things are indestructible, those little drones, and it's still operating perfectly. As you've also seen, though, I was running into all sorts of problems with tires. I'd got 3,000 miles across America on one set of tires that I bought in the UK, European-made tires. But all of a sudden, now that I was relying on American tires, they were rubbish in comparison, and I was picking up huge punches like this. However, I was carrying something with me which I would recommend to anyone who is feeling silly enough to want to do something like this themselves, and that is a big reel of tape. This stuff will get you out of any sticky situation. This and cable ties. Take them everywhere with you, in your backpack, in your pannier. This will get you out of any situations you find yourself in. So I had now entered the panhandle of Florida. I crossed over the border around Pensacola. When you've already cycled 3,000 or 4,000 miles and you enter your last state, you take a cheesy selfie next to the Florida state line. And while I had been followed by all sorts of interesting animals along the roadside, I'd seen vultures, I'd seen coyotes, I'd seen terrapins, I'd seen bullfrogs. Now that I was in the balmy, warm air of Florida, I was seeing alligators on the side of the road. As I got towards Miami, one of the biggest cities in the United States, I was having to stay safe but also cool. That's why I was resorting to this sort of Bo Peep style fashion. And then I had to then try and zigzag around Miami, pretty hellish day, getting into Miami and then out of Miami. I ended up at the southernmost point of mainland United States. And then from there, I spent my last final 3 days, rather ironically, going back west to get to the southeasternmost point, along 42 different bridges, 102 miles, all through the Keys, the Florida Keys. And I'd been daydreaming about what my arrival in Key West, Florida would look and feel like. I expected fanfare, I expected celebration, but I ended up arriving on the busiest day of the year. And it meant that having just cycled 4,500 miles across America, just so that I could get one final photo with the southernmost boy of the United States, meant that I had to spend an hour and a half queuing up to take that photo with all of the day trippers that had turned up just that afternoon. Nevertheless, to ride across America, it took me 10 weeks, 11 states. I got through 4 tires, I'd had 8 punches, which isn't really that bad. I'd lost 3 kilograms in body weight. That was about 7% in body fat. And I'd covered 4,373 miles. However, behind all these numbers and statistics are hundreds of hours of interviews with many more dozens of middle Americans with just these myriad fascinating opinions, which I recorded on my phone, and thank goodness I didn't lose, or this would have been a much shorter book. It would have just been me complaining about the coffee and talking about getting sunburnt. But thankfully, those voices became this book, which came out about 6 months ago. The hardback is still out, and the paperback is due out in June. And before I finish, I just want to say thank you, like I always do, to all of the people I met along the way, because they very kindly offered me their frank opinions about the United States. I've done journalism all across America, all across the world, Many people see and hear that you're a journalist and they say thanks but no thanks. Riding across America, of all the hundreds of people that I spoke to, not a single person told me they didn't want to speak to me. So as a journalist, it's quite easy to do journalism there because people just open up to you. And I want to finish by just saying thank you to all of you for being so interested in this ridiculous subject and putting faith in these crazy expeditions of mine, because it keeps the lights on, and it means to keep that I get to dreaming up ideas like this and going off and doing the next one. So thank you very much, and I now invite any questions you may have.
Well, thank you so much for your talk. We really enjoyed it. The question I had was, from your experience, which state was the most polarized by the election, and which state surprised you the most?
Yeah, so I guess maybe the state that I saw first, and that was Washington. So what you're always going to face in terms of the sort of political polarization in the United States is this difference between, there is a very big rural and metropolitan divide. So 9 times out of 10, if I was cycling along the road in rural America, I would bet my house on the fact that I would knock on someone's door and I would know exactly where they would lean politically. Cities are different. People would talk about blue islands, and especially university towns. So university towns in America nearly always lean to the left. You can extrapolate that from that however you wish, you know. Yeah, I would probably say Washington was where I saw it at its most stark, because Seattle is a very blue place. It is a very left-leaning city. But then as soon as you get out of the city, rural eastern Washington is considered very Republican.
And my question was, in your speech, you mentioned how you sort of done 2 journeys across America with sort of 8 years in between. Did you notice any really noticeable differences in people's opinions or political thoughts on the 2 different journeys?
Yeah, so one thing I do start to think about in the book at more length is how in 2016, this whole idea of conspiracy theorists and people having quite wacky, you could argue quite wacky, quite right-wing, quite or far right-wing views were kind of concealed onto the internet, and people were sort of often only talking about those things in the privacy of the internet. However, what I found on this trip was that people were a lot more open publicly discussing things which a lot of people, some people would consider to be quite wacky ideas. So I think maybe, yeah, the more sort of the public nature of some of those opinions has changed.
That's really interesting, thank you. I think we're now opening up to the audience if anyone has any questions.
Thanks. Thank you for the talk. There's a lot of talk about polarization and division, but what I'm interested in is, what do these diverse people have in common that unites them as a single nation or an entity, do you think, in your view?
Well, again, this is something which I naturally started to think about as I moved towards the end of my journey, and I moved towards the second half of my book, because although perhaps the idea of polarization is the thing that took me to America, because from a distance it really does look like that, there are, of course, things which people are very proud about bringing the country together. So a lot of people spoke to me about national parks. Like, the idea of the Great American National Park is something that is apolitical. Hopefully all of America can get behind that. And I think one of the things that I really started to drill down into is small town values, which I think is really special in an American context. I went to a high school football match, and it was one of the friendliest and exciting experiences I've ever had. I didn't know what was happening on the pitch, but there was probably about 5,000 or 6,000 people there watching their local high school football match take place. And I said to a few people, you know, like, who are you supporting? Who's your relative? And they said, oh, you know, we don't really know any of the kids playing. We just happen to be from the town, which I think is really quite unique in that regard. What I did also find is that a lot of people on both sides of the political spectrum were telling me that they're ready to move on now. They feel like, a lot of people told me that, especially in the election that's just gone, is that America had two pretty bad candidates. You know, without wishing to sound ageist, people told me, you know, we're voting for two people in their late 70s. This is ridiculous. Surely we can do better than this. So I think a lot of people are, on both sides, looking forward to what happens next, and hopefully that will bring America together a little bit more.
Thank you. That was a really interesting talk. I wanted to ask, when you were saying that you were bumping into all these Republicans in the small rural towns, were their views Republican in the sense of what we might imagine to be right-wing politics in the UK, slightly more extreme, or were they Republican in the sense that they just supported Trump, so it was more of a pro-Trump sort of thing rather than the Republican values themselves?
I would say that the vast majority of people were more likely to just have Republican values or anti-democratic party values. The philosophy was almost like, he is the best we have, therefore we're going to have to vote for him because the alternative is even worse in their eyes. But a lot of people did say to me, he's, you know, a lot of, especially people I spoke to in the Bible Belt, or, you know, lots of Americans are very religious, evangelical Christians, and a lot of people said his values, his brash nature, you know, his views on certain things do not appeal to me on a human level or a religious level, but he is the Republican candidate, therefore I feel like I have to vote for him, basically.
Thanks. You crashed your drone at the end. I'm intrigued by how you film yourself with a drone when you're moving. There was one shot when you were cycling across a bridge,
yeah,
and the drone was going higher and higher, and I was thinking, surely he's got to have a cameraman to do that. No, so a lot of faffing around, basically. So, you know, I'm a journalist, storyteller's the quite sort of pretentious way of calling it. But ultimately, with any of these things, I want to try and break down that sort of, how do I put this? A lot of it involves me having to sort of put a camera on the top of a mountain and then ride back down and then ride past it and then only use 3 seconds of it. Because I want to give the impression that I do have a cameraman with me, but I didn't. I was completely on my own. Because I want to be able to create nice little videos like this. So this is probably the last time I ever do this talk, maybe. Up until sort of Christmas, I probably did this talk 50 times at theatres all around the country. I was actually at Wimbledon Literary Festival. And I find that hopefully you'll agree that it's nice to talk for 7 or 8 minutes, but then it's nice to show a short film because there's only so much I can sort of blather on stage. It's nice to sort of illustrate those points. So yeah, a lot of it. So for example, those new drones, you can get them to track you. You can put it up in the sky and draw a little box around you, then it will give you a nice track. However, with that reveal shot, which you saw the bridge, if you look really, really closely at it, I've got the drone here, and I'm pulling back on the joystick or whatever it's called, and just so that so it goes like that, because I want to always be trying to create visually exciting shots, basically.
First of all, thank you so much for the talk. You mentioned you've been all around the world. Could you comment on some sort of like the key differences and values from the rest of the world that American small towns sort of intrinsically have that, I guess, make them quote unquote American? Thank you.
That is a very good question. Can you try and rephrase it slightly so that I can think about it in a slightly different way? So,
I mean, I guess maybe could you comment on some of like the key values that American small towns, that you noticed American small towns having that maybe other countries in the world sort of didn't, anecdotally?
yeah, I guess, I mean, of course you could go anywhere in the world and find strong communities in small villages and towns. I think there is a great pride in education in America. One thing that I did find really interesting is the American reverence for higher education. So, for example, even if you lived in a university town or a college town, and even if you'd never been to college and no one in your family had ever been to that college, there's a great source of pride associated with the fact that you live surrounded by academics and you live in a college town. And those, for example, where was I? In Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and it is the home of the Crimson Tide, and their NFL, their college football matches get over 100,000 attendants to these huge stadiums, and they're not all alumni, they're not all students. So I think that's one thing that kind of really sort of separates America, is this pride of the high school and the pride of your college. I guess perhaps sort of the enormity of the United States is the idea that, you know, if you live in the middle of America, you might be 2,000 miles from New York or California or anywhere else like that. It's quite, I think, one thing I started to sort of realize on this trip is it's very hard for people to feel part of the whole of America. So actually, the thing that you're most concerned about is your direct vicinity. Perhaps for us, we live in this tiny island in contrast. You could argue that perhaps our sense of community spirit is less so because we are surrounded by so many people in a smaller area, if that makes any sense.
We've got time for one more question.
Thank you. A very interesting talk. Thank you very much. How internationally aware did you find the people you met as you went across the country? I mean, I've heard it said that Americans are very insular and aren't really aware of what's going on geopolitically.
I mean, there's no sort of real way of beating around the bush, but I would say that again, the more politically aware people I met were Democratic voters, people who, I don't want to be sort of too condescending, but like, I met a lot of people on the right who just seemed very set in their ways, very sort of, you know, like, this is the way I've always voted. This is the way I vote because I've always voted that way. This is the information I have. Therefore, there's no point in looking for any other information because this is the information. Whereas I generally seem to find that people in America who are perhaps a little bit more left of center are more willing to be, you know, have their opinions challenged about things. Again, I think this is a big stark difference between what I found between America and Britain, because I actually think that even people in Britain who consider themselves to be, I don't think, right-wing, are nowhere near as right-wing people in America and left-wing in America as well. I think we're a lot more centrist here. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's, if anyone's interested, you can check out the channels here. There's loads more films on YouTube and stuff. And yeah, the book's available if anyone wants to read it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. What a fantastic talk, and thank you very much as well for some great questions from the audience. Thank you so much for coming today. This was our last Enlightening Minds talk of the term, but we are going to be returning after Easter. Tuesday, the 6th of May, is a date for your diaries. I think details are going to be published soon on the box office website. Keep your eye out. I think it should be a very good talk. Just before we wrap up, as well as thanking Simon, I could also thank Arvind and Sophie, and also Dan Donovan, who does all of the amazing AV work. So if we could put our hands together. Thank you very much. Have a good evening and a safe journey home.
Thank you. Cool.
Thank you, Simon. That was really, really
Hopefully
good.
what you had in mind.